So it was a group of Africans called the Moors. They ruled in Europe for over 700 years. Warriors and scholars from North Africa who crossed into Spain in 711 AD. They built advanced cities, introduced algebra, medicine, and even streetlights, while the rest of Europe was stuck in the Dark Ages. Cordoba was once a global center of learning, blending African, Arab, and European cultures. However, in 1492, their final stronghold fell and their legacy was nearly erased from history. A lot of history has been covered up, but video by video will uncover the raw truth. Follow to be a part of the journey.
Now, many African Americans love to lay claim to being Moors, that we are the descendants of Moors. I even have some in my family who claim to be Moors. When I've researched my family lineage, unless they get it from their mother's side, no Moors. But as this creator said, let's get down to the raw truth of things. In order to understand the true concept of where Moors come from, we have to start with this map here. This map demonstrates the growth of the Arab nation, how the Arab nation came into being, and give you the time frames and the years by which they were conquering. And as you see, it all begins in Saudi Arabia with Muhammad conquering the majority, if not all, of the Arabian Peninsula. And then as the centuries go by, they conquer up into the Levant, over into Turkey, over into what's called the Near East, and into the Indus Valley. And then they move over across North Africa in around during the same time frame. After conquering North Africa, they move into what is known as the Iberian Peninsula, which is Portugal and Spain. And even though this map doesn't show it as clearly, into the Italian Peninsula and Sicily, Sardinia as well. These were Arabs. These were not sub-Saharan Black Africans who were doing this conquering. But yet, there are some Black Africans, some Saharan Black Africans, who were considered and became part of the Moorish community. But how did that happen? That is where this map comes into play. That from the 7th century all the way up to right now in Libya, we have the trans-Saharan slave trade. And in the trans-Saharan slave trade, the Arab nations went into the first parts of sub-Saharan Africa, into Mali, into the Congo, into these areas, or into Sudan, and they began to conquer these people. And as they conquered them, they brought them across the Saharan desert as slaves. Now, according to Islam, once a person is brought into their household as a slave, they can then convert over to Islam. And then after they have converted over to Islam, a way should be made in order for them to become free. Some of those methodologies for them to become free is to become a part of their military, much like how if you're a foreigner and you want to get American citizenship, join the American military and you will gain citizenship. So the sub-Saharan Black Africans who became Moors are the ones who first came as slaves, and then after being a slave and converting over to Islam, they were then able to become part of the Moorish community, even though they didn't necessarily call themselves Moors at that time frame. The term Moors was a actual negative language that was used by the Europeans to describe those who had came and conquered in the Iberian Peninsula and into the Italian Peninsula. Now, so that you can have a clearer understanding of slave trade going on in Africa, let's look at this map. Because as we can see in this map, the Saharan slave trade affected the northern central African area. The Indian slave trade affected East Africa for the most part. Now, some of the Ethiopia, Somalia was part of the trans-Saharan slave trade, although it didn't really go across the Saharan. They just went up the Red Sea or around the Gulf of Oman and into what we call the Persian Gulf today. And the transatlantic slave trade, which most Black people in America are from, It came from West Africa down to the southern tip of Africa. Now, so let's think about this logically. For 700 years, although the trans-Saharan slave trade lasted for 1,200 years, but for the first 700 years, the trans-Saharan slave trade incorporated sub-Saharan Africans into their group through the art of slavery. Yes, they held positions, but most were holding positions below that of the Arabs. They went into Europe. They taught them hygiene. They taught them a bunch of different things, colleges, universities, street lights, all the different things that this creator said, basically true. The image of them all being black, completely false. There were even white Moors. These white Moors were mostly found in the area of Mauritania and Morocco. But it wasn't until around the 16th century, which would be in the 1500s, when the Moors were pushed out of Spain and out of Italy, that then you get them leaving. Did they go to sub-Saharan Africa and then become the slaves of the transatlantic slave trade? No. Did the Spanish and the Italians then make them slaves and send them over to the Americas? No. A small group of them was sent into France, which is why you have Moorish ancestry for those black people who are in Spain, but not all of them, but for some of them, because a small group was sent there. The overwhelming majority went to nowadays countries of Morocco, Algeria, Algiers, Tunisia, those countries, those northwestern Arab countries is where most of them went. Some of them did go to Mali, but the Mali was not the majority of the group that was sent over to the Americas. When Pope Nicholas V wrote his papal bull to tell the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch to go into West Africa and South Africa and force them into slavery and force them into Christianity, that was not the area of the Moors. So to make that claim is a false claim simply because you want to inherit the idea that you brought all this technology and knowledge to Europe, and not the fact that your ancestors were like anybody else, sometimes conquerors and sometimes the conquered. We have to remember that there is a longer history in West Africa. There's a longer history of the people of West Africa than that of the transatlantic slave trade and even that of the trans-Saharan slave trade. That many nations and tribes and kingdoms rose and fell in all these areas, just like in every other part of the world. There is no shame in it. It is just what happened. But if you have to validate yourself by attaching yourself to this short little time frame in the grand scheme of history in order to feel better about who you are and about your ancestors, well, that speaks more volume to your insecurities than it does to what the actual truth is. I know that for my family, the overwhelming majority came from West Africa. Some were indigenous to America. The overwhelming majority came from West Africa, came to this country during the transatlantic slave trade, and have absolutely nothing to do with Moors. So now that you have the information, what is your logical thought process to all these Black Americans claiming to be Moors? So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.